Welcome. This is a People for Effective Government presentation. And the topic tonight is, just a minute, I have it here, data science for social good. And it came about because I was talking to the director of the Spokane Public Library, and he recommended that we find out about the community data coordinator at the library and what they do. And PEG is People for Effective Government, and I'm going to read a statement about who we are and what we think. And I am Barb Care. I've lived in Spokane since 2010. And I used to teach over in Seattle. I'm a West Sider for 60 years. And now I live here and I love it here. And I find this fascinating. It's like going to college without having to go to college. And PEG is a nonprofit Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've been holding in-person forums and online events since spring of 2018. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. Through these forums, we are working to encourage sincere and civil debate about the challenges that our nation faces and about effective solution to these challenges. If you are finding these events helpful, please consider joining as a member or making a donation to PEG. I'll speak more about that at the end of the meeting. We are a 501c3 nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations. As always, the viewers presented by our guest speaker, the views are their own. As a nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind, unless you consider this a political activity. The audience is asked to use the Zoom Q&A feature to submit questions. And once again, thank you. I'm gonna introduce Shilo. Shilo Deitz works for the library. She is the community data coordinator. I think that's right. And she can tell you what her job is and how she does it, and she will introduce our speakers. The audience, if you can't type a question in Q&A, you can also go to chat and try to type a question. And so right now I will introduce Shilo. Shilo Deitz.
Thank you. I'm going to share a little presentation. So let me see. So thank you for having us here. As Barb said, we're going to talk about data science for social good in the smart city. Now so I'll briefly introduce myself and my role at the library, give a brief overview of data and data storytelling, and introduce you to the project that David, Shawna, and I are working on related to data and homelessness. I will then hand it over to David and Shawna to introduce themselves and talk about using data for social good from their perspective. As Barb said, please put your questions in the chat as you have them, and we will try to address them as they come in. We'd really like this to be a conversation about data in Spokane and how we can use it for good. I'm in a new position with the library, community data coordinator. This I started last January, but just went full-time last summer. This is a joint position with the city, which aims to open data and work with the community to understand and use it in innovative ways. First, I'd like to quickly review some of our big picture goals for the data coordinator position. We are drawing a lot from the IMLS Civic Switchboard project, which I'll drop a link to in the chat. That project, they believe that strong partnerships between libraries and other local civic data intermediaries better serve users, democratize data, and support equitable access to information. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the chart here is a bit of our vision for this project going forward. We are already conducting lots of these activities and have lots of ideas for our future role in the community in this sphere. I also want to emphasize that I am a resource and can schedule a time to talk through any ideas you have about using data or any data stories that you'd like to work on. I will drop a link for booking time with me in the chat as well. As I mentioned, my role is in part to do with publishing and engaging the community with open municipal data. Open data are data that anyone can freely access and use. The promises of open data for communities can be seen in this visual: opportunity, participation, empowerment, and transparency, among others. In Spokane, open data is related to a new master data management strategy that we are in the process of implementing. David and Shawna can speak to this as well. Master data management, in the simplest sense, is a platform and shared governance policies for data across multiple city agencies. The master data management plan has the potential to make the provision of services in the community more efficient. As a first use case of the MDM, we are looking at how we might use the data to address homelessness. The goals of this project include, but are not limited to, mapping out anonymized data related to specific unhoused individuals and their path through public services and/or the criminal justice system. For example, do some individuals follow a path that leads out of homelessness? Do others follow a path that perpetuates homelessness? To evaluate current city and partner procedures to find things, let me go back there. To find things that work and things that don't work. For example, are we taking the right actions in the criminal justice system? How can we strike a balance between supporting the unhoused and supporting business interests in the downtown core? Are we funding the right initiatives? Would it be better to put more funding into mental health programs, emergency shelters, long-term shelters, or reducing legal debts of unhoused individuals? And then we're also looking for any other patterns that we might not think of that might emerge from the data. Here is a visual of what that might look like, from the data sources to the MDM to data-driven decisions. So on the left are the various agencies and potential data points related to homelessness that we can then feed into the MDM and link the data by person code in a way that protects individual privacy. This will potentially allow us to answer questions like, are there individuals who are utilizing more resources than others? Is there service with better outcomes than other services? Are individuals living in camps less likely to utilize services than those living in shelters? Are there strategies we can implement to reduce camps and steer individuals towards services? Are our policies and procedures effective? Does the data reveal any patterns or insights that we haven't considered yet? With that introduction to our topic and project and myself, I'm going to hand it over to Shawna to introduce herself and talk about her perspective on how we might use data and the MDM to reduce or ameliorate or better address homelessness in our city.
Thanks, Shilo. I'm Shawna Ernst. I'm the IT director and digital forensic lab manager for the Spokane Police Department. My background is actually in spatial data analysis. I did an undergrad degree with a geographic information systems certificate at Eastern. And then I worked at Spokane County in their geographic information systems program under county IT for about 12 years. I also got my master's in urban and regional planning with an environmental emphasis. And then I went on to get my master's in business administration from WSU and with a finance concentration because I'm a glutton for punishment, and pursued 3 different professional certifications in project management, disciplined agile, and then in the governance of enterprise IT. So I moved from working in spatial data analysis to managing law enforcement records systems. So from the time the call comes into 911 through police mobile to when they write their reports through that entire justice system, I managed that large software system, which is used by every law enforcement agency in the county except for the city of Cheney. So that was a really big task. And then moved to the police department 2 years ago where I took on a higher level leadership role. So as far as the homelessness data study goes, what we identified in the beginning phases of this project is that there's a misconception about how people navigate the different systems, especially the criminal justice system. The system's really complicated. And so I'll just walk you through a little bit of how it works for someone who is unhoused. If they are cited for something like a sit and lie violation, which is enforced during the daytime, so they may be given that citation, which compels them to go to community court. And at community court, the goal there is to partner them with resources. That can be mental health resources, drug rehabilitation, emergency shelters, financial help, whatever they need. It's a tailored program to that individual. And then they perform some community service in the neighborhood where they were cited, and they can graduate from that program without ever going to jail. So that's one thing that I see a lot, doesn't get maybe referenced in exactly the correct way. A lot of people think it means that they're getting arrested and put in jail, which is not the case. So there's that. From that system, there's a lot of other endpoints, right? Like they may be partnered with housing authority. They may be partnered with, neighborhood health and human services. They may be partnered with a shelter. There's just a lot of different options. And we've found that there's people who get multiple citations for sit and lie or unlawful camping or other low-level violations, and they just can't seem to get past the criminal justice system and into housing and stability. And so my goal and interest in this is to help identify those pathways that are working and functional, and what causes one person to escape homelessness and find housing and one person to not escape. Because from the perspective of the police department, they're asked by the community and by business leaders to handle homelessness, and the issues surrounding homelessness are a lot more complicated than just issuing a citation, cleaning up a camp. You have to deal with all of these downstream pathways and potentially upstream pathways to actually resolve the issue. So we looked at, what can we actually do as a city to help address this? And that's where we came up with the idea to find all these different data sources. So things like detention services data from David's group, which he'll talk about, data from the housing authority, and pull that all together into a single system so that we can actually map out these pathways that different individuals take and look for ways to improve things. And hopefully that, lessens the burden on the police department and improves outcomes for these individuals and improves the system as a whole. So that's how I got involved in this project. And one other thing I wanted to note is that Shilo and David and I all sit on the city's governance committee for data. So we're currently working on the policies and procedures that surround data. that includes everything from how we're going to share data in a way to promote transparency while protecting privacy, how we can integrate with some sensitive data. David's system has a ton of sensitive data, so does the law enforcement system. How we can do that in a way that doesn't damage anyone, and then look for opportunities to reduce bias. Data bias is a big topic right now, so we're working on an anti-data bias policy and trying to work through some of those issues to ensure that what we're doing is fair and equitable and has positive outcomes. And I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Shawna. I'm not sure how I'm going to follow Shilo and Shawna after that, but I'm going to try. So my name's David Lewis. I'm currently the Senior Program Manager and the Community Management Information System Administrator in the Community Housing and Human Services Department at the City of Spokane. So a long title. Just real quick on my background, in terms of education, I have my master's in public administration through Eastern Washington University and my undergrads in history with a minor in classical studies. So actually not necessarily aligned, you would think, with data, and yet here we are. I do have a certification in database administration through the University of Washington, and currently have an appointment to WSU's College of Medicine as a clinical instructor, and work at Eastern teaching students to better use data to address real world problems. So this is really in part what we're going to talk about tonight. In my role, I manage, in managing the CMIS, that database, that repository is the single entity through which just north of 30 different social service providers within Spokane County interact. So that repository contains an exhaustive data set that, as Shawna indicated, contains a lot of sensitive data, all of which is used not just to directly meet the needs of the client, maybe even predict what needs that client might have down the road, and those like that client, but also to help us evaluate our performance as a community towards addressing a lot of the big social problems that we all know about, talk about, and are working towards. So that matters like racial equity is such a big topic right now. We use data to directly inform that. I see. Thank you, Shilo. Yes. So by client, what am I talking about there? So I'm referring to those that are experiencing homelessness or otherwise make up our vulnerable populations. We use that as kind of an umbrella term. The organizations I support, which range everything from DSHS, the VA, SNAP, Catholic Charities, to medical providers such as CHAS, Frontier Behavioral Health. We work with Justice, so I work very closely with Spokane County Detention Services. So all these agencies are serving vulnerable populations. That could be individuals or families experiencing homelessness. That can be those that make up what we call ALICE populations, asset limited, income constrained, employed. So those that are right on the margins that could become homeless, but otherwise rely pretty heavily on social services for their stability. And so that's when I say client, that is what I'm referring to. And in the role in providing that support, we're collecting, again, very sensitive data in the database. Currently, we're managing privacy laws such as HIPAA, FERPA, 42 CFR Part 2, SAMHSA, and other state and local guidelines. And I'm a subject matter expert in those areas, and try to inform policy in regards to how we're meeting those federal and state obligations while also being able to use our data for the betterment of those that we serve, but also our community. So it's really a balancing act in that regard. So the CMIS database, we're collecting that data. It serves as a single point of entry for assessing client needs. And again, there's that client term, and referring them out for the services that we determine that they need. So it's not just a place where data goes, but it's an active case management tool that allows these dozens of different providers that single point of access where they can all come together using the same data set to help inform the care decisions that help get to stability for those that we serve. And I think, and as we talk more about data for the betterment of Spokane and the social good, that is one of the use cases I think is so powerful. Is before we had such a system, these providers were all in their silos. Maybe they were calling each other, maybe they were emailing, they were trying to communicate, but it was very burdensome and time consuming. And what we're able to do through a shared database platform is provide the means for the force multiplier effect that good technology that's intentionally applied can bring. And I think I'm gonna wrap up right there.
Shawna, would you share the story of the finding you had related to the car citations? I feel like that's really illustrative.
Sure. So one of the goals of the data study is to have an open mind and look for things that we otherwise might not identify. So what I did was when I pulled the police data and focused on tickets and citations related to either those sit and lie ordinance or the unlawful camping ordinance, or tickets and citations to individuals who don't have a home address. So in our system, they're marked as either with the address for House of Charity or a designation called general delivery, which means that they just pick up their mail at the post office and they don't have a PO box or a permanent address. So I pulled together all of the tickets and citations for those individuals and sorted it by frequency, and found that there was an individual, a woman who's unhoused, who had $1,600 in fines in a single day.
Wow.
And she had been pulled over in the morning and cited, ticketed for not having a license, not having registration, and having expired tabs, and then kept driving her vehicle, and later in the same day received pretty much the same tickets all over again. And so that wasn't something I was expecting, right? And it shows that there's an issue here where I don't know what the solution is, but there's an issue, right? This woman, how is she ever going to get herself out of her current situation and into housing if she doesn't have the funds to even get a driver's license or get insurance? And so I don't know if that means we need more real-time information for officers so they know those tickets have been issued, because they probably didn't on the second one. They're out doing their jobs. Or maybe we need some sort of program where we help people get back on their feet with licenses and with tabs and insurance. I don't know exactly how that looks, but it was telling that we found, potentially something we could tackle within, a half an hour of looking at the data.
And question about kind of data provenance and metadata potentially. Barb was asking, how long does new data stay current and relevant? With that, I was thinking we could also speak to just concerns around like metadata and interpretation and how we decide or communicate the quality of the data.
Shilo, would it be okay? Because I thought it was really awesome that Shawna was sharing the project, and I have a real quick kind of follow up to that project, because I think that was such a good example. And in my area dealing really with homeless and vulnerable population data, the impacts that what we refer to as sometimes super users of services, the impact that they can have on a system is immense. And so, for example, there's a very famous study, Malcolm Gladwell published this study called $1 Million Murray, which was this homeless individual that over the course of 10 years actually cost the city there $1 million. And this is a great example of, because there wasn't effective communication as far as organizations coming together to try to figure out how do you best meet the needs of this individual, that individual kept accessing emergency services, ER rooms, kept having run-ins with public safety, and those costs just continued to mount, which is unfair to the individual and the society in which that person is residing. So I wanted to share that because I think it's yet another good example. And what we try to do, and part of the great potential that this master data management project has that I'm working on with Shawna and Shilo, is that we're going to be able to use that data from police and fire to combine it with our other data sets to try to derive that greater meaning about, well, how are we doing in helping people, and where are those people that have fallen through the cracks, that have been receiving services but really not moving along on where they need to go.
And those are both really good cases of, the intervention would be presumably in the client or in the person's interest, but we can also use the data to show that by doing these sorts of interventions, like for example, a licensing clinic or help with that we will actually save money and resources in the long run. So that sort of thing makes it easier to make arguments about new programs.
As far as, how long is the data good? I would say that it really depends on the data. Yeah. Some data is really temporal in nature. Like a good example is the weather, right? The weather data is only good for a very short period of time. If you look out a month, it's not good anymore. If you look back a month, it's not really that useful. Some other data is useful for longer periods of time. If they do the census, they do that every 10 years. That's probably too long because your population changes so much in 10 years, but a yearly update is okay. When you're looking specifically at law enforcement data, we tend to look at trends over time. So we will pull 3 years of data, 5 years of data to look for different trends. I did just find something that was interesting. So I pulled data related to violence against the Asian population because of what's going on nationwide, and looked at 3-year trend. And February of 2018, there was this big drop in all crime, every type of crime. And it was because we had that bad snow year. And so that's one where the data is fine. There's nothing wrong with the data. It's still valuable, but you might lose that context for the data the farther away you get from it. I remembered the bad snow but in 5 years or 10 years, people might not remember the bad snow and be sitting there wondering why there was this big drop in crime in February.
I think that's a great example, Shawna, also of where the meaning you derive from the data can become, like, there's always a bit of caution that I take, is if you don't account for all the variables, you can, like in this case, weather and how that influenced it, you may walk away with different interpretation or reasoning behind the change.
Barb had a good question here. How can we know if we're making a difference? What's the criteria? Maybe David and Shawna could speak to, do we have metrics? And then I had a thought also.
Yeah, I mean, just in my, with the work I do, it's all about metrics. I mean, in part because we do so much in terms of funding projects and activities, and that funding comes with strings attached, those strings being performance measures and expectations of how we're supposed to administer those dollars, and performance targets that we're expected to meet. And that's everything from the number that we are expected to house in permanent housing, the number that are expected to increase their income, or other measures of that nature. And so that's really where the system I administer, we use a lot of data from that system to determine, are we meeting those metrics or not? And if we're not, that's where it gets really interesting, because we spend a lot of time, applying different methodologies to try to derive why are we not, what factors, really what factors are preventing us from meeting those targets. And sometimes it could come down to lack of staff on the part of one of our agency partners, or it could be a myriad of other effects.
And your clients, they have responsibility. How can you make them hold up their end?
Well, that's tough, right? So I think when we're setting, you almost have to account for some degree of, like, you account for that when you're setting expectations. So for example, if I'm evaluating a certain type of project, let's say I have 6 different service providers all administering a similar type of project, I know based on longitudinal data really what's possible as far as performance. And I have to account for, as you put it, the client not holding up their end of it. So it could be that sponsor of that project is doing an excellent job. They're doing everything they possibly can, but at the end of the day, personal responsibility on the part of the client, it doesn't happen. So when we're setting expectations, performance expectations, they have to be measurable and they have to be attainable. So otherwise it just doesn't work politically or otherwise. So we have to take that into account, and we rely heavily on our longitudinal analysis of past performance to inform what is possible and where can we try to push things a little bit to try to get that performance just a few percent better.
In the paper this weekend, when they talked about that gal who left the homelessness department, and they talked about the people who are, I think it was in that same section, they're talking about people who are ready to move into houses, and it's permanent housing, and they've been on a wait list and all that. How do people go from just living in a camp to being in that position where they get to move in and have a house or an apartment or whatever, permanent housing?
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's a big question. It's a very complex system. So there's a lot of different paths somebody can take from, as you put it, being in an encampment to being permanently housed. And where that all begins is with what we call our coordinated assessment, coordinated entry system. And that's my database supports that system. So what happens is, let's say we have project leads in our community that administer that system. So SNAP oversees the coordinated assessment system for singles, and Catholic Charities oversees that system for families. And what that system does is it seeks to make our homeless services more efficient by assessing that client's needs, determining their acuity, or how extensive the service need is, and then referring that client to the specific provider that's going to meet that need. So if I'm living in an encampment, and let's say it's just myself, and I go to SNAP to assess to see what services I'm eligible for, they're going to do that assessment. And if I'm determined to meet the eligibility criteria for permanent housing, or maybe a different type of intervention based on my need, then I would be routed to that provider, and that service would be provided. What's challenging is that we are in a very tough market for housing at the moment. Mm-hmm. So that means that a lot of our options for housing someone are limited. We don't have rental inventory at the moment, so we can't place them in a rental. We do have brick and mortar permanent housing options, but those have very low turnover. So sometimes those that are seeking that type of service will be on a waiting list. And that's true as well with the housing authority. They offer voucher programs, a different type of permanent housing. And it's not uncommon to be on a waiting list for sometimes years.
Oh my.
And what David's saying speaks also to, in sort of a roundabout way, the power of, this new program, the power of collaborating across organizations, because then we have some awareness of the limitations, like he's saying, with housing, and can think about, new or different kinds of interventions. Shawna, you can speak to, how long has this project been underway? 2 years?
Master data management as a whole has been underway for 2 years. We just finished this project in October, this specific task.
Yeah.
So this is newer. And as far as how do we know if we're making a difference within this project, I would say we don't yet. We are still in the early days of this and need to develop some metrics too, but we're just not quite there yet.
And a quick question in the Q&A for David. Maybe, David, do you know if we know how much an unhoused person costs?
There's a lot of studies on this. As far as how it's something a lot of communities strive for. We don't do a lot with that because of the unreliability of what we end up with data wise. And the reason I say that is because we're still not at a place where we have a good accounting of budgets, like on the part of our partners, what they're spending. So if we're really trying to reflect on that, we need better financial data in terms of the pass-through funds that the city operates, what our partners are spending. We can look at, based on, for example, one program we call the COC program, which is entirely administered by the city of Spokane. We'll arrive at cost estimates based on what we call a cost per exit or cost per placement based on those funds, but it doesn't get us to that, like how much overall does an unhoused person cost. So to provide that kind of answer, I would defer to the various studies that are out there. And I wish I had those on hand because there's a lot that influences what that cost is. So for somebody who's chronically homeless, which is a designation that HUD has created, which is a very specific nature of homelessness. It's somebody who's been homeless for a year or longer, or has had 4 instances of homelessness over the last 3 years, and has the presence of a qualifying disabling condition, like just any kind of long-term physical disability, mental illness. Those individuals or families that are chronically homeless have the greatest system cost. And in some cases, I've seen some studies out of LA that have pegged that figure around 38 to 52,000 a year, based on service consumption. And there is going to be a wide margin there. And some of those studies are older and would need to be adjusted for inflation. I do wish we had that data in Spokane. I think that's
There are also, I think, a lot of positive examples or positive arguments for also, data can tell us one story, but it can't tell us everything. And so sometimes the big metrics, like how much does someone cost a year, that just would be hard to do in a really valid way. And instead we can do things like what Shawna proposed. In the case of the ticketing, we can see the cost there and then the officer cost of pulling them over, their time, and break things into really concrete that we can say, instead of this large thing of the cost of a homeless person, it's like, well, in this day, this kind of ticketing that was, we don't want to say counterproductive, but was doubling up and kind of exacerbating a problem, that's how much it cost.
I think you also have to define where you're going to draw the boundaries on the costs. So like, if you're just looking at city services, that might be something that you can come up with a number, but a lot of people experiencing homelessness also go to the emergency room, and how much does that cost? And they may not have insurance, or they likely don't have insurance. There's also services that a lot of people don't think about, like county has a detox center where people can go to get off of drugs and alcohol in a temporary manner. And a lot of times that's people who are experiencing homelessness. And so where do you draw this boundary over what's included in the cost and what's not included in the cost?
And when we're talking about costs, I think we also have to consider And this is something that I face a lot because there's this argument about, if we're talking specifically about those that are experiencing homelessness, there's a moral argument to be made that it's the ethical right thing to do to provide the assistance. But sometimes, for various reasons, people aren't inclined to take or to agree with that. So then there's the economic argument. And when we're looking at the costs for example, ER room visits and whatnot, even no matter the most expensive housing assistance programs we have don't come close to the same costs of not providing that assistance, that system impact from not housing people. And that's really where the notion of a housing first model came from, is that there's a recognition that if you house someone, regardless of whether or not you're able to immediately address other conditions that they have, you're still better off than having that person reside on the streets, being arrested, going into the ER, relying on all a range of services that are being provided in the most expensive way.
Or go ahead, Barb.
How do your individual employers support this? Do you get to do this on your work time, or is this just a hobby that you do on your own?
So I don't know about Shawna. Shawna doesn't stop working.
Yeah, the police department definitely supports what I'm working on regarding data. They have a commitment to being having greater transparency in the police department data. We actually just released the biggest data study we've ever released. So they are definitely supportive. I have too much on my plate, so this feels a little more like a hobby sometimes because I'm doing it on nights and weekends instead of during the day, but that's my schedule.
Shawna, could you speak to really fast? I think it would be interesting to people, the data bias or the bias in policing study that you did.
Sure. So we pulled as much data as we possibly could out of our that big 911 dispatch police record system I mentioned earlier. And so we started from Jan 1 of 2017 through the end of June 2020 is when we started that project. So that's why that was the time frame. And started with calls for service, and then grabbed data of the outcome of that call for service. So someone calls 911 or there's an officer initiated stop, and what was that call about? Did we write a police report? Did we issue an arrest report? Did we do an infraction or a citation? And then the demographics of that person that we're interacting with. So in this case, not the victim or witness, but the person who's going to experience the outcome. So the person we arrest or ticket or cite, or give a warning, whatever it is. So we pulled all of that data and then hired a consultant, Bob Scales with Police Strategies LLC. And he did a really robust analysis and wrote over 300-page report about it. And basically found that typically most studies of racial disparity in policing are focused on the underlying demographics of the population. And so they compare everything back to that underlying population. Bob suggested that we look at a different model for that and look at who is being mentioned as a suspect or arrestee in the case reports that we submit to the FBI. We report all these stats to the FBI. And then look at the demographics of our interactions in relation to that, that metric instead. Because the police don't interact with every member of society, right? The police interact with people who are a victim or witness or a suspect. And so when we looked at that information under that different lens, we found that all races are equally likely to be stopped by police. And then once stopped, and in this case, a stop means an interaction. So a traffic stop, or we get a call for domestic violence and we interact with the spouse. That also constitutes a stop in this definition. So of all of that, every stop, we are equally more or less equally likely to issue a ticket, a citation, or arrest somebody. And so the study said, Bob said, we can't know if there's bias in individual officers. You don't know what's in someone's heart, right? But overall, it shows it doesn't show evidence of systemic bias in the entire department. There were some racial disparities that we're looking at in more detail where Black people and Native Americans have a higher rate of use of force when they're being arrested than other population groups. And so we're taking that really seriously and looking into that. But as a whole, there weren't indications of systemic bias throughout the department. And I will go ahead and pop a link to our press release about that. We have a video and the full report. We're also releasing that data. So this is amazing. We have never released this much data ever. So this is very transparent. We're going to keep it up to date. I actually just pulled the data through the end of March of 2021. So now we go from January 1 through March of this year. And we'll make that available publicly. It'll be part of the city's open data platform. Another thing that is related is our use of force data. So we actually put all of our use of force data out on the city's website and have for years. A lot of police departments just don't do that. It's one of those where it's a little scary to put that much data out for anybody to see. And you do have some concerns about people misinterpreting the data. So, but we're committed to transparency and we put a lot of information out there. And we also wrote a guide to the data to try to make it easier to understand because we do have a lot of, industry terminology and it might not be as easy to follow for someone who isn't experienced with law enforcement.
I think that gets at, we have a question in the chat. How do you know what data is or will become relevant? How do you avoid a closed system or self-fulfilling prophecy? If I'm interpreting that right, that's kind of the promise of open data, that if you let enough eyes look at the information, you kind of bring in those different perspectives. And David and Shawna both talked about, both work with also area experts. David works at EW. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, David, the people that you're working with at the universities.
Yeah, so it's partly to out of concern of not having enough people looking at the data, but also I think it's really important, and I have to tell myself I'm not the smartest person in the room, and I do rely on experts that really are the ones that we rely on when it comes to a lot of the analysis we use. And so in partnering with our local universities, what I was looking to do was find really individuals at the top of their fields that we gather all this data, and I am an analyst, and I do that's my area of expertise. But in deriving conclusions from the data, it's really helpful if we're, for example, trying to infer what are the social determinants of health, what influence does that have on the success of one of our clients in one of our housing projects. I would rather rely on those that have medical backgrounds, that have studied that extensively, hence why I work with WSU's College of Medicine, because I rely on that faculty, those students, to tell me, are the conclusions I'm deriving, are they valid, are they not? What areas do I need to consider? So we're able to do a lot more collectively than we are individually. And it's a community benefit, right? Because by working with those universities that already have students engaged, we're able to provide that as an opportunity to those students to already be working on real world problems in their communities. So it's really a great opportunity for everyone. And selfishly, it helps me do a lot more with the staff I have without increasing our budget. So it's more fiscally responsible, a good use of tax dollars, because we're not adding staff, we're using resources that we already have in the community.
It's similar for our study with racial disparity. I could have done the study myself, right? Like Bob mostly stuck with percentages. He didn't go into a lot of technical, like standard deviation kind of statistics. So like I have the background where I could have done that same math, but it doesn't make sense for the police department to have a police employee look at their racial disparities. Like that's not going to go over well. People aren't going to trust the data. So we, while we extracted the data, I was very careful to extract it as a whole. Like I didn't remove anything or eliminate anything. It is the data, and hire a consultant to do the analysis so that it's someone outside of the police department doing this analysis. He actually works for the police ombudsman and developed our use of force dashboard. And so the ombudsman is our civilian oversight. So not only did we hire someone outside the department, but we specifically hired the person who works with our civilian oversight group, which is separate from the police department.
What is big data? What does that mean?
Data that is high in volume, velocity, and variety, but it used to be thought of as, the definition is a little bit fuzzy, data that that you would need a special computer to analyze potentially, but now our computers are bigger, which was a question I thought might be interesting, thinking about how technology and what we have has changed your work over the years.
Who would you like to take that one, Shilo?
If either of you have thoughts, or if not.
I do actually, because it's made a huge impact in the homeless service sector. And when we talk about how technology has advanced, I mean, it's really evident in homeless service delivery, because about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't have we weren't anywhere near where we are now. I mean, the practices of social service providers were very were driven by in a very non-technical way. So we're using paper forms. Information really wasn't tracked in a way that was accessible to other organizations, or really to allow for the level of collaboration that's needed to address complex problems like homelessness. And to see where we are now, where that's available in real time, and we have that electronic profile of each client that's being served, that's updated by these diversity of providers. That's just been awesome to watch evolve. But more specifically, it's how the technology has adapted. It has not necessarily changed how caseworkers and agencies do the work, but has supplemented in a way the work that they're doing, or has allowed them to do the work easier. So for example, we have these street outreach teams that go out into the community, that go under bridges, they go to encampments, and they're trying to provide services, engage with those that are experiencing homelessness in the hopes of getting them housed. And due to the nature of the software we use, that can work on a PC, a laptop, but it can also translate into a smartphone or a tablet. It's cloud-based, it's accessible. So it's not a burden to the caseworker. It meets them where they're at. And it allows for really, it allows to continue to collect the data that we need to continue to work with that client. So, yeah.
I would say we have a similar story where we've gone from paper systems to replacing paper systems with electronic forms, where it's still difficult to get the data out of the form. Like every time you've done a fillable PDF, that's just it's a replica of paper, to now more modern systems where it's field-based, so that you can really easily query for that information out of the system and get better analytics. And where we're going, I think, is going to be a lot of video analytics, with everybody having a Ring doorbell and a cell phone in their pocket. Video is everywhere, and we get a lot of it. And so we're trying now to figure out how to better get data out of that video so that we can utilize it more efficiently.
It's interesting too, because all of this is new and happening so fast. So with the master data management project, we've gotten kind of stalled on governance and policy because it's all new and it's kind of about like trying to foresee potential problems that have not yet occurred. But they're also serious. It has to do with privacy and breaches and all of these things. So
I look at it and it sounds to me just like a whole lot of extra work for every single person who works in the system. I mean, dealing with technology, some people love it and they're just like, fish to water, but not everybody goes into this stuff to be spending all their time on their device, but you have to be.
I think it's going to get better. I see that as, when some of these systems first came online, you had to be an expert to use them.
Mhm.
And over time, the applications are getting easier and easier and easier. And pretty soon you'll be able to just narrate your text into the app and you won't even have to type. So I feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel there, but I get what you're saying. Like you almost had to have a degree to run some of the early programs.
And I think there's also exciting advances, however controversial they can be, with AI, for example. So I know of tools that are currently in use that work with the vulnerable populations that I serve, that will, for example, exist as an app on an individual's smartphone, but using something called natural language processing. That technology will follow up with that individual after appointments that they're scheduled to go to. It will check in with them to see how progress is going, for example, on a new job, or if they have any needs, and it will interpret what that individual types or says, and it will interpret that information, upload it automatically into a database, and then based on conditions selected by the caseworker, flag which records or which requests need to be looked at first. So whereas a caseworker might be spending all day on a phone trying to track down clients and do all these rote tasks just to try to do their work, this is where we see technology being able to actually make life easier because it's doing some of those tasks for that individual.
And that artificial intelligence, or AI, and machine learning and natural language processing, all of those tools are amazing, but it makes effective data governance and that anti-bias policy even more important.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty critical to make sure that we're not inadvertently building bias into these machine learning processes. One study that has come out is it's related to kidney transplants, and there's a marker that indicates that you may have kidney problems, you may need the transplant, and that marker is also related to your muscle mass. So they found that they built this algorithm to look for this marker, but didn't account for people with higher muscle mass. And so Black people, and I'm speaking very generally here, but in general terms, have a higher muscle mass than other races. And so they were getting flagged differently for kidney issues. And it was actually affecting their health and the impacts of going to the doctor. And so that's just one example, but there's examples all over the place. And so we're definitely taking our time with that anti-data bias policy to make sure that we're really thinking of everything and treating people with equity and respect and all of that.
because in most cases, it's like as you were saying, a tool that is meant to be good, but ends up having an unforeseen consequence in some way. We have a good question in the chat. How can we combat the misrepresentation and misuse of data that we seem to increasingly see? My argument to that would be going back to kind of data storytelling, and that, we've had discussions about how you could take a data point, and depending on what your aim is, you could leave out some metadata, leave out some information, and tell a different story. Like a case that happened with the library was a few years ago some reporting on 911 calls at the library. So the story was, at first, the library is so dangerous, but it was missing a field that was saying why they were calling, and it was often like well checks, non-dangerous, more of like a social service provision. So the more true story is probably that the library is filling in sort of a social or community need that isn't being filled elsewhere. So do you guys have thoughts on that?
It's a really tough question. I think you're always going to see some misrepresentation and misuse. We're in a pretty polarized society, and people want to, promote an agenda. All we can do on our side is make sure that we're not contributing to that in any way. So treat the data like we're scientists, right? We don't want to go into something trying to find an outcome that isn't there. We want to be non-partial and make sure that we're at least not a factor in that. And then effective communication about the data, like what Shiloh's tasked with, making sure that we're doing that data storytelling in a way that we at least get through to most people. You can't totally combat it. And that's part of the kicker with data transparency is you are putting it out there where someone could misuse it. And I don't know exactly how you combat that, except follow best practices yourself, set a good example, and tell the story the right way.
And like Shawna's done a lot of work with metadata, which is data about data. So that would describe, I mean, this would require someone to do all this investigation themselves, but would describe what the field means, appropriate use, inappropriate use, right, Shawna?
Correct, yeah. Like the data we released on all of the police calls for service, I went through every field and gave as robust a description of what that field means as I possibly could, to try to alleviate issues with unintentional misuse, that someone can at least read through that and get a good idea of what something is actually saying.
I have a question. How long have you been working on this project?
On the racial disparity project, we started that in July, and just released the report in March. So that was a really long project. On the homelessness data study, we started that in October.
And with that project, we were kind of running forward and then realized that we had a lot we needed to figure out with our governance policy, just because it is sensitive data and we want to, make sure that we're careful about how we're connecting it.
How do you know when you're done?
When we have good, solid policy recommendations to take to leadership at the city. I think when we have a laundry list of here's some actionable things we can do to help ameliorate homelessness, that's when we'll know.
And some of it is infrastructure. Like David and I have been working with Spokane Housing Authority to bring their data into the MDM. And so once it's pulled in, that stage will be done. And then we have the analysis, which could be ongoing. But some of those are concrete, like we can get the infrastructure set and then we'll be done with that.
Yeah, I think that we'll, as far as the MDM and where we want to take it and the continued role of tech, I don't think we'll ever be done. I think with the project at hand, I mean, we're going to have a lot of these types of projects where we're looking to either scale the MDM or to address very specific questions, but just as long as there's challenges or problems within the city of Spokane and in our region, I think that the use cases will just continue and there will be new projects.
And we already have a stack of new projects that we haven't been able to start yet because, part of this in reducing the silos of data, people see you do it once and then they want to do it more. I really need access to the water department's data or whatever other data set to help solve a business problem or a community problem.
Wow. So on your wish list, is there some topic you would love to study that you can't get to?
I mean, I personally wish I had more time to spend. I spend so much time at the management level, and I haven't had as much time as I would like to research and even take classes on emerging technologies, because my area of interest, like where I really wish I could spend a lot more time, is on a lot of those emerging AI technologies and machine learning and natural language processing, because I've always been interested in technology as a companion rather than a burden in work, and I think that is going to get us closer to where I think we've always imagined it going.
When I hear you talk about that side of it, I get happy. When I hear the other stuff, I get stressed. So I wish you luck in that. I hope you can do it. I think that would be lovely. I think we'd all like to have our own little AI thing. So get to it.
I'm on it.
I'm excited once we get this infrastructure in place. I'm excited to do more community education stuff and some work away from the computer.
And when you think of that, what do you think of? Do you think of just adults? Do you think of reaching out to high school kids too?
Yeah, so my sister-in-law, we talked about, and then the pandemic happened, and so we didn't, but she works at the new Lumen School. And
Where's
there's a lot, it's a new charter school with Spokane Public Schools for high school students that are parents. But there's a lot of great ideas about kind of citizen science projects where people go out and collect data and learn about data through sort of the collection and the processing and the full stage. So my dissertation was in part about curb ramps, and those are also really useful to all sorts of populations, including people pushing strollers or whatever. So we had talked about doing kind of infrastructure assessment, data collection as a project. But yeah, there's just there's a lot of cool things that we could do around data education that is like away from a computer and can kind of bring more people in.
Is there anything the public can do to support what you're doing?
Me specifically?
I mean, I'm retired, and there's a lot of people who are retired, and there's a lot of people who have time and like to do meaningful things with their time, and they want to make a difference. But could you train a little cohort to help you go do something,
Yeah, that would be a great idea. I think what we're going to be moving into in the next, in the fall, is just kind of trying various programs and seeing how they go. So I think staying involved, following along if you're interested in what we're doing, and coming to the events, giving feedback, book an appointment with me. I would love to do that.
Just for all those in the audience, I have an appointment booked. It's very easy to do.
And it's the community data one. We have a few different appointments you can book on the library site, but it's the community data one. Otherwise, you would talk to our business librarian or our tech support, which would also be useful.
And also some musician, right? Because you can also,
yeah.
I was amazed at that.
But yeah, I think it would be great to do even some joint between maybe students and adults joint program, especially with the charter school. I see a lot of kind of flexibility because their classes are small for us to try things out and then go from there.
Excellent. Shawna put out a link, and is this the link to the thing that they finished and they're making very public? Is that what that is?
Yep. So the first link is to our press release related to the racial disparity study, which includes a video of the press conference and the data itself, the study, and the guide to the data.
Okay.
second link is to our website, to the page regarding use of force, where we've put out data consistently for years.
Excellent.
And that's a good example of the metadata, right, Shawna? That's on that first link.
Yep, that's true. There's a guide to the data that I prepared that goes through every single field and lets you know what they're for and how we use them internally.
I'm looking at notes that were written before. I guess this is,
Quickly, or go ahead, Barb, do you have something?
well, maybe this is one that came from you, that maybe someone put it in. What did you learn from your experiences of managing and developing data science tools to better serve vulnerable populations? At a gut level, what's your feeling about all this? Are you excited about what it can bring? Are you frustrated that it's just, you know, more clutter, information clutter? Or do you think it's going to clear out the clutter?
I'm sure everyone's going to want to talk about this, but I'll go first. I'm excited. I think this will help in a huge way because we've looked at data related to homelessness in silos. David had the most robust repository, but was missing pieces from these other areas. And so to look at it holistically and see how complicated it is will really help in looking for solutions. It's a really complex problem, and you just have to get in there and look at all of the different intricacies to be able to even come close to figuring out how to help. And so I'm excited. It's overwhelming at times. It's a lot of data, but I think this is the right step.
Shilo, is the library going to teach people how to deal with data, how to look at it, how to?
Yeah, that's kind of, so my position's new, so it's like a lot of things right now, but I think that's the goal long-term once we kind of have some of this stuff set up. But education around, and that is where I feel most optimistic when it comes to data, is putting the tools into the hands of vulnerable populations, however defined. There's been a lot of cool projects that are more like community started, and that's what will be possible with open data. Like one project I really like is called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and it was started by a community organization and tracks evictions and kind of almost flips the situation. Rather than tracking people who have been evicted, they even have a page where they're tracking evictors and like how they maintain their property, and almost doing this community policing that is helping or raising up people who we otherwise disadvantaged. So that sort of thing is exciting to me.
And we can find out about all this by having a consultation with you? Is that how? Because you're not publishing all this stuff. You don't have a newsletter or anything, do you?
We don't right now, but that might be a good idea.
I would read it.
If there would be interest in that. Yeah, I think the way that everyone can help right now is just to give a sense of like, what is interesting? What is there a need for? And you can send me by email or make an appointment or whatever.
And how do we get your email? I mean, I know what it is, but how does the public know your email?
I think it's on, I'm gonna just drop it in the chat just in case. I think it must be somewhere on our website, but I'm actually not quite sure where.
I had to call to get it.
Oh, really?
I couldn't find it, but that doesn't mean anything that I didn't find.
Well, that's something we should improve too. I dropped it in the chat for now.
I see it. Yeah, that's great. All right.
There was a small question for Sean, I think. Did you answer that?
I answered it in the chat. So the question was, what's the next step for the police chief after the study completion on use of excessive force with the BIPOC community? And I know that Chief is taking it seriously after the study results. He's talked with the executive staff at SPD and with community groups and is looking for ways to address that issue. So I'm not directly involved in those discussions, but I've heard him speak publicly to the Police Advisory Committee and in our press conference that, you know, even though we haven't seen indicators of systemic bias in the department, we can't rest on our laurels. It did raise these issues of higher levels of use of force with Black and Native American populations, and it's an issue of concern to him that he wants to work on with those community groups. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that, but that's a little above my level.
Do you do, or we had a program where we had two researchers from Washington State University, James, and they studied conditions of policing and all that. And they discovered, you know, that lack of sleep is a huge factor, and the shifts and extra duty and all of that. And when there's just so much going on right now where police are doing the absolutely unbelievable things. And I think, how much of that is exhaustion, or is any of it exhaustion? And is that a subject that would be up for study? How would you study something like that?
Yeah, I know that Dr. James have done a lot of work on sleep studies with officers. I don't know if the department has participated in any of those. I personally haven't looked into that. That's a tough thing to study. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, that's not a good answer.
No, it is. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any final thoughts? Or Barb, do you have anything final before we hand it back to you?
I have lots of things, but I'll save it for when I see you, because I don't know if it's appropriate here. Because I would get into the medical community and their record keeping, and school districts record keeping, and how accurate is the records that are being kept that you're gathering data from. When I was in the hospital, I had surgery, and I got an email from somebody who'd been in the operating room, another doctor, who talked about a totally different procedure. And I thought, what's he talking about? I mean, that's the kind of record he kept. He was talking about, something that I hadn't even have done. And that's in my record now. And I thought, how much of that goes on everywhere?
We worked with SPS on digital equity some this fall. So we had census data on broadband connection, FCC data on where there is broadband, like service providers, and then requests from the school, and some informal conversations with community centers. And what we found with those three sources, we found that the data wasn't good, like that students weren't requesting where they probably needed it, which suggested to us that they didn't know to request, that there was an even bigger gap, that people didn't know about the resources. And again, it's like, that was sort of a combination of like qualitative human work and the data, and we saw that it was wrong. And so it being wrong almost told us something, if that makes sense.
At least you didn't go out and make big decisions on that data. So I find this very fascinating, and I am very interested in taking your courses when you finally have them. And I would love it if you had a newsletter and said what you were doing and what people could be involved in. And this this event will be on our website in a week or two, and I'm not sure. Somehow we will get these links posted. I'm not sure how. I may have to even email you to get them again, but we'll get them posted somewhere. And I don't have any more questions.
I just clicked chats, save chat. So I'm hoping that worked, and then I can make a list of them.
Oh, good, because there's quite a few in there. Yeah. Thank you so much for this. It just opens a whole new world. The library is bigger and brighter now than it used to be. And where is your office?
It will be at the central location, but
And
I'm
when,
interested in working at the Hive some because that will open before central.
where is that?
Hive is over on kind of near the University District. Am I correct? I should know right where it is. I think it's on Sprague.
Oh, cool.
It's a really cool space.
Is it open?
No, but it'll open this fall, and Central won't open until about a year from now.
Will the Central have AI and things like that when they open?
Maybe our community technology person, he does a lot of like coding kind of stuff and almost more not analysis, statistical based AI, but other sorts of robotic things.
Cool. Very nice. Well, I thank you for your time, and this has been fascinating. And I look forward to seeing you when I see you. And thank you, David, and thank you, Shawna. And you folks earn your money. You work very hard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay, on behalf of PEG, I thank all our viewers and invite, if this is of interest to you and you like things like this, please consider becoming a member of PEG. We would love to interact with you, get your ideas for potential speakers, and grow what we're learning so that it doesn't just end here, that we can get involved in making our community a better place. Membership for a year is $60. You can make a donation, and if you go to our website, you have everything you need to know about how to become part of us, and it is fun. So that's it.
All right. Have a great evening.
You
Thank you
too.
all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.